So I'm Fiona Clarke, a autism consultant and disability advocate. I work with a variety of public and third sector organisations, including the Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh. I'm a trustee of Scottish Autism, as well as being a director of EUCAP. So today I'm going to just provide you some results of the 2022 survey that we did on autistic experiences and views of ABA. The survey closed in November, and this is sort of preliminary results, and we'll be looking to get a report out in June. So I'm going to give a quick background about the survey and talk about the survey structure before getting into preliminary findings and then saying what's going to be happening next. So we decided to do the survey because understanding what are helpful or harmful approaches for supporting autistic people is really important. And ABA-based interventions are increasingly being used on autistic people. We know that it's widespread and mainstream in the US and is growing in Europe too. And considerable efforts are being spent by disability advocates, parents and professionals and allies in this area of understanding what are helpful and harmful approaches. And so we hope that this survey will provide new information to support advocacy efforts and guide the further work of EUCAP in this area, as well as others. So the survey was online for 32 days, to the end of November. It was for autistic people only. So the responses that were analysed and showing are those that were able to confirm either that they had a formal diagnosis or that they self-identify as autistic. It's an independent survey, so it's not robust scientific research. And the survey was published in 14 languages, so we could get a spread of responses across Europe and beyond. And our focus was Europe, but we were interested in other views and experiences wider than that. The survey mainly consisted of 15 multiple choice questions, and within that there were some open answers and also 3 larger open-ended questions. It's probably worth mentioning now that when we reported in middle of November at the EUCAP webinar then, we had 200 less responses than now, and pretty much all the quantitative analysis and much of the qualitative hasn't really changed since what we reported then. So it's quite consistent, the feedback that's been coming through. We're still analysing the results, so the figures I give today may change slightly, but nothing that I say today am I expecting to change in any way of significantly. We had a total of 825 autistic people responding to the survey. It was very well engaged with, so people who did respond pretty much answered every question. And in the open-ended comments, there was a lot of engagement with those. So we had 387 comments about people's personal experience of ABA. We had 445 comments explaining the nature of any concerns they may have had. And I should emphasize that the concerns of people who supported ABA or maybe who had issues with ABA. So concerns were from all respondents. And then there was other question at the end which said, feel free to anything you haven't mentioned before, please, do say. And we had 195 comments in that. So these are over 14 languages. So we're still working through some of these. We're aware that a lot of people would put a lot of emotional effort and time into and resource into completing the survey. So we are doing everything to make the most of what they've told us and to sort of really do what we can do with the information. In terms of who did reply, so there was 825 in total, and of those, 78.5% had received a formal diagnosis, and the remainder were able to confirm that they self-identify as autistic. So in terms of age, most people were between 25 and 60 years old, so over 80% within that category. And we had only a very few who were older, over 60, but we had a significant number who were also younger, so under 25, there were 15%. In terms of the gender of respondents, most that replied confirmed they were female. Typically on these sort of studies, we do get higher responses from females. And also amongst the autistic population, not surprisingly, a significant amount confirmed that they were non-binary. And within that, there were people reporting as alt gender, gender fluid. In terms of the spread of respondents, we had replies from, there was from 6 continents, and 40, I had figures here and I've just lost them, from a wide range of countries, and they're listed here. We had responses from other European countries, included responses from Greece, Norway, Estonia, Austria, Hungary and Israel, Serbia, Luxembourg. From other countries, outside of Europe, we received responses from Mexico, Philippines, Malaysia and Africa. So we had a huge response from across a lot of countries. And the blue table bar chart there is responses that we received from European countries. So 137 were from the UK, that was the highest by far who responded. And you can see there the other countries. Outside Europe, we had just over 140 from the USA. In terms of diagnosis, so we asked, if they'd received a formal diagnosis, and here I've reported individually on countries where responses were more than 30. And what we can see, compared to the average of all responses of 78.5, pretty much every single European country were above that, except for UK and Portugal. The US, the average rate of who had a formal diagnosis was slightly lower were lower at 64%, which brought the overall average down compared to what we're seeing in Europe. New Zealand had 3 responses from New Zealand, and they were the overall lowest rate of formal diagnosis on those that responded. So what we can see is that by far the vast majority of people who responded to the survey had also received a formal diagnosis. In terms of the membership of autism organisations of the people that responded, there were 37% in total belonged to an organisation that was autistic-led, and 15% belonged to a EUCAP member organisation, and 26 belonged to another autistic-led organisation. People were asked just to tick every box that applied, so some people did belong to more than one type of organisation. For those that only belonged to an autism organisation that wasn't autistic-led, was just a small percent at 2%. But overall, just over half of respondents reported that they did not belong to any autism organisation, whether or not it was autistic-led. In terms of the experience of people who replied to the survey, so there was overall that people did have quite a considerable amount of experience of ABA who replied. So in terms of those who had been in ABA themselves, 19% had received ABA. In terms of those who had a family member who had been in ABA, 21% had. And again, these categories were not mutually exclusive, so people were able to tick whatever box applied to them. And there were almost a third had either themselves or had a family member who had been in ABA. Only a small number, 8%, had actually delivered ABA themselves. And in terms of how people acquired their other experience about learning about ABA, only 3% had an ABA certification. And then a huge amount learned about ABA informally, as well as formally, so studying ABA, but not actually receiving a certification. So that might be through observing or reading research and literature. What is key here is that if you look at the number who only learned about ABA through social media, and so hadn't really studied it or hadn't been in ABA themselves or had a family member, it was only less, it was 8% of the respondents. So it's a very few, a relatively small percentage of respondents didn't have maybe more first-hand experience or hadn't actually studied it or looked into it. So there was a whole good range of experience coming through. This is what we asked about: what were people's general view on ABA? The pie chart on the right is a summary of all the respondents. And the figures here aren't inconsistent with other surveys that we've seen. For example, Chris Bonello has reported on people's views of ABA before. So there were around 4% of respondents were either strongly in favour of ABA or just in favour, and that's the green colours in the pie chart. 67%, so that's 2/3, reported that they were strongly against ABA, and 14% reported that they were against ABA. Around 1 in 10 felt they didn't know enough about ABA to answer, so there was an option for that too. And on the left, you see the bar chart, and these are countries where there were respondents, more than 15 people responded. And you can see that that flavour is pretty much consistent throughout all the countries. Of some notable features is that Italy had more people that were in favour and smaller numbers that were against compared to the other individual countries. And that was the same with Finland as well. Some countries reported fewer than 4% in favour. So countries like Denmark, UK, Netherlands and Canada had very few that were in favour compared to overall respondents. I should also mention the Czech Republic as well. They reported anyone in favour. So in terms of experience about receiving ABA, so we've, as I said, the open-ended questions, and we had loads and loads of comments, so I've just extracted a few. So in the what is your experience, we had a question on, please, provide any information about your experience. So the first one here from Belgium: I started hiding unwanted behaviour, which cost a lot of energy. My environment, parents, teachers, etc., thought that I was doing better while I fell into depression. It took a lot of time to get out of this and learn to stop feeling guilty about having autism. Someone from the UK who had been in ABA said, it completely ignored what I was going through and just tried to make me comply and do what they wanted me to do, as they saw the way I was as not normal. I basically had to mask my autism to make others more comfortable and feel happier, whereas I was still struggling on the inside and everything just building up. I just want to say that when I was going through the comments from the survey, it was really quite upsetting. So not underestimating what the experiences that people did have and the efforts to report on them. Shaming, humiliating, erasing, taking away autonomy, taking away dignity, emphasis on modulating my external presentation with the primary goal of placing others' comfort above my own, causing me to question and self-erase for decades until understanding what was done to me. That was someone who was in ABA in France and reporting how that made their experience of ABA, how it made them feel, and also how long afterwards it is taken to recover. Sweden, someone reported that rewards, being told that what I did was finally half decent, almost like a normal person would do it. And punishment, so physically and emotionally abused. That was someone who had ABA in Sweden, so reporting about this idea of how the impact of being ABA emotionally was punishing and not just any physical punishments. Estonia said, Someone who received ABA in Estonia reported it was humiliating and tiring, and mental violence. Just a couple more. So in the UK, someone who'd had a range of various experiences of ABA and PBS, including in their family themselves and also in their workplace. So in all their circumstances, no consent was ever sought, without any consideration of what the concept of success is. Although compliance seems to ease the burdens on others, it just never seems to solve anything. People can only hold themselves together for so long before they blow. In terms of one of the positive comments, in terms of a comment about someone who was in favour of ABA, they reported that their experience was very positive. I have learned how to stand in real life and interact with normal people. I think it is the most effective way to learn as an autistic how to approach real life. That was someone in Belgium. So quite a contrast. To give a flavour, in terms of people who were in ABA and shared their experience, there were 73 comments in total, of which 10 were in favour. So that gives a bit of the balance. So when we asked about people's general view, and I reported the overall position before, what I've done here is to split it down between those who were in ABA themselves or those who had a family member who received. So if you were in ABA yourself, you may have also had a family member, but there were some family members who they themselves weren't in ABA. So the picture is follows the pattern of the overall responses. So what we're not seeing, we're seeing very slightly that those who were in ABA or had family in ABA slightly reported more to be in favour, strongly in favour, but also reported, more likely to report that they were against or strongly against ABA. And what was, of course, what we're seeing is people who had first-hand experience are less likely to report that they don't know about ABA. So what we're not seeing is those who have had first-hand experience, or even people who had reporting on their family members having ABA. We're not seeing a huge, yes, actually, we support ABA. There's not a big change in picture here. So the pattern was consistent throughout. We asked people about the position in their own countries. First question was, how widespread is ABA in your country? So just over half said that it was significant, although just under a third, almost a third, said they didn't know the situation. We asked, is ABA growing in your country? Around a half weren't sure, didn't know about the situation. And 28% thought it was significantly growing, and 19% was growing a little bit. So almost half were aware of it being growing, although around the same also didn't know what the situation was. So what that is showing is it is significant in different countries, but there is also maybe a lack of understanding about what the current situation is in each of their countries. We then asked, are you concerned about ABA in your country? So 86% were either significantly or a little bit concerned. So it is an issue for many people, they are concerned. And this is whether you're for ABA or against ABA. But just under 1 in 10 didn't have an opinion on it. And only the smallest percentage were not concerned. And when we're looking at the pattern about, well, did the views change whether people themselves had been in ABA or a family member? Again, no. What we're seeing is, so concerns were higher when people had experienced ABA, either themselves or a family member, rather than what we may think we would see as people who have been in it, know it, have experienced it, are less concerned. So again, you could be concerned whether you're for ABA or against ABA. So the patterns there are consistent. So we asked about the nature of people's concerns, and there were 445 comments. We received about 73 different themes, which we put into 5 broad categories. Again, we're still working through clarifying these and checking these, but we don't expect the pattern and the direction or position to change. So by far the most general theme was the fact that it was just generally wrong. So people reported it was abusive, or akin to conversion therapy, and that it needs banning. So there was this category of things that just showed that it was generally wrong. The next category of concerns was the harms from ABA. So people specifically mentioned harm. And, you know, a lot of those were saying that there's, you know, significant pointers and indicators that ABA is causing harm. And the fact that ABA seems to prioritize behavior over people's needs, and also that it goes against human rights. So these are some of the harms from ABA. In terms of autism-specific concerns, that was the next category. And some of the concerns reported as, for example, that you know, it goes against autistic neurology and goes against people being authentic to who they are, their own identity, that it prioritizes comfort of other people, non-autistic people around the autistic person, and also that ABA goes against current understanding of autism and goes against acceptance of autism. So people feeling they couldn't be accepted for who they are, and there was a need to mask and camouflage. The next category was to do with systemic issues within the field or through practitioners, or that was happening at government level. And some of these themes were the fact that, you know, ABA in some places were the only thing offered. And I think these are mainly from the US. We need to analyse these a bit more. And that these were ABA was in place of supports that people thought would have actually been helpful for them. Other systemic issues included the fact that sort of the ABA methods and are being embedded and covertly in other therapies or other places, such as in schools. Systemic concern was how the field seems to allow even the most abusive practice. For example, the electric shock aversives that are used at the Judge Rottenberg Centre. Concerns are also the way that the field operates, the way it grows, and the tactics it uses to recruit and grow. The last category was of concern, actually, which I found quite surprising, was the growth of ABA. But I suppose none of these are really mutually exclusive. There's a lot of overlap, but it's interesting to see the themes. So the growth of ABA included the growth of the derivatives of ABA into other methods, for example, into positive behaviour support. And also the fact that ABA was growing through what people felt was the ignorance of other people about ABA. So did the people's levels of concerns differ across countries? The yellow bar here is those that were significantly concerned. The reddish ones are a little bit concerned. And what we can see is, yes, those that had significant concerns did differ across countries. So we had countries like the US and the UK, where the most respondents were from, and other main countries like Ireland and the Netherlands and Germany, and Finland did have greater significant concerns than some of the others. But again, it was a very similar pattern across, where mostly there were significant concerns, and then next category was to be a little bit concerned. But what I've done here, and I've pulled out information here for countries where there are individual respondents more than 30, otherwise it would have been too busy for today. But when I add in those concerns, they're a little bit concern or significant concern, we can see that the picture is more consistent across countries. So maybe between 4 and 90%, between sort of 70 and 95% were concerned, either a little bit or significant. And I suppose what we're seeing is that the percentage who are just a bit concerned and against the percentage that are significantly concerned can vary across country. But in terms of countries generally being concerned, that is consistent. So what were some of the comments about people's concerns? So we had 448 comments about the nature of people's concerns, of which 16 comments were about people who were in favour of ABA, and 448 comments were people who responded that didn't report they were in favour of ABA. So just some of the concerns were, and this is someone who had received ABA in Finland, by its very nature, ABA is inappropriate for modifying autistic behaviour, as it is, I need to move the box to read this, sorry, as it is not based on finding the causes of their behaviour. ABA is just a fancy word for teaching autistic people to hide their autistic behaviours, almost always by threatening their own mental health. Someone who received ABA in Germany mentioned their concern was that this destroys the self-development of autistic people. So this was a key theme that was coming out, was that the ABA stops people developing in a way that's authentic for them and natural for them. So someone who'd received ABA in Belgium said that ABA ensures that self-regulation is impossible and everything ends up on self-control, which can cause secondary problems such as anxiety and depression and problems with identity and self-esteem. So this idea of people that were in ABA were not able to develop their own self-regulation and dealing with that and the regulatory issues resulted in secondary issues. I pulled out a couple of comments here on people who were supportive of ABA about the nature of their concerns. So someone who had a family member who'd just been in ABA in Ireland reported not developed enough and with competent people. So ABA is often misperceived and too expensive. Someone who had sort of been involved with delivering, been involved themselves in doing ABA and PBS and had a family member who received it, so they were concerned about the growth, the difficulty in maintaining oversight and consistency of practice. One of the questions was asking whether any of certain factors about ABA, could that change people's views? And the reason for this, it wasn't expecting sort of necessarily that these factors might make someone who is against ABA necessarily suddenly be in favour of ABA. But, to what extent would these change your view on ABA? So, you could be really against ABA, but if these things were in place, would that help? Would that change your mind? So we asked about whether the type of ABA, so whether it was discrete trial training or intensive behaviour intervention or a more naturalistic type of ABA. So would the type of ABA generally change your view? We asked whether the goal that was targeted in ABA, so what were the behaviour goals to do with and all about? One of the factors we asked about was whether there had been consent from the person that was in ABA. We asked whether just using reinforcements and not using any positive punishments, would that change people's perspective and views? And we asked whether the extent to which the ABA therapist understands autism would impact views too. There was also a category on other comments, and most of the people who put in those fell into one of the categories I've just mentioned. A few others were mentioned, for example, the extent to which the intervention is integrated with other therapies rather than just being done by themselves. Other people mentioned about, well, if it's not actually ABA and just called ABA, that would change my mind. And the extent to which ABA is neuroaffirming, so this idea of, is it really supporting natural autistic neurology? What we saw was that for each of the categories, for over half the respondents, these things would not change their view of ABA. We also found that in terms of those categories which were the most significant and could sort of influence the view of people, was whether consent had been given and the extent to which the therapist understands autism. So they were key factors that could make people, would sort of influence people's view, though the people's view were more sensitive to those factors. The next two was the fact that it was depending on the goal targeted and whether the therapist just used reinforcements and no sort of positive punishments. That was the next category that might influence the view. And quite interestingly, the least sensitive category was the type of ABA. So you often maybe hear about there being a new type of more naturalistic ABA, as if that would allay people's issues with ABA. And what this is showing is That's not necessarily the case, because people's views aren't that sensitive to it. One of the questions we asked was whether people are aware of organisations who have position statements on ABA, and about just over a third were aware, and 2/3 weren't. And people provided names of 98 different organisations who had a form of position statement on ABA. Some of these were clearly ABA providers or ABA regulators, but the vast majority were from advocate organisations. We need to do more work on looking behind these and what's actually been reported in the statements, and we'll be publishing that more detail on those in our report. So we asked people, okay, what can UCAP do to support you in this area? And we can see that most people, and again, these were not mutually exclusive, people can tick all the boxes and tick other, and also provide information. There was an open box for people to say what other they would like UCAP to do. For UCAP to issue a position statement on ABA was the most popular. The next was to understand more about ethical interventions and supports, followed by joined up advocacy efforts, and then also to understand more about ABA. So 1 in 4 said they would like to understand more about ABA. There was 15% reported other, and what was it other? Most of them basically stated to ban ABA, to get ABA banned. Some others were reporting they wanted a clear position statement against ABA rather than just any position statement. And there were also a few who said that it would be helpful to get more research done in this area, and that this area really needed some more research. In terms of the top 2, so UCAP position statement and help to understand more about ethical interventions and support, those were consistently the top 2 across all European countries. The next 2 listed there, so the 3rd and 4th ranking ones there was a high level of consistency across countries for those 2 categories, 2 being 3rd and 4th. So that really brings me to what I'm going to report on today. And so what's next? Well, we're aiming to publish a report in June with the findings and all the analysis. UCAP are looking at holding discussion with individual member organisations to establish more their position and direct UCAP's work. And we hope that the output of this survey will be useful for a whole host of reasons. So autistic people and their families, for people's advocacy efforts for good supports and ethical supports for autistic people, for policymakers and practitioners to influence the work that they do, but also to identify areas that merit further research, because studies like these are helping us understand the landscape, helping us to understand areas where we do need more robust and formal research in there. So thank you for listening. I shall unshare my screen and be available for some questions.
Thank you, Fiona. And we can take a longer question and answer session at the end. But now, if anyone has a quick question or 2 for Fiona, we could take them now. I don't see any hands coming up. So I believe our next speaker is Dr. Yo Dunn. Yo, are you ready to present?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Heta.
And with introduction, Yo is from the National Autistic Taskforce in the UK, which is a small organization of autistic experts. And they have published the Independent Guide to Quality Care for Autistic People. Please go ahead, Yo.
Thanks very much. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Some of you, I'm sure, will already be aware of the NAT Independent Guide to Quality Care for Autistic People, which is, as Heta said, published by the National Autistic Taskforce in the UK. The focus of the National Autistic Taskforce is to draw on collective autistic knowledge and expertise in order to provide a stronger autistic voice on issues of particular relevance to autistic people who are less able to advocate for themselves. And those involved in NAT have a particular interest and relevant expertise in this field. The NAT guide tries to set out an autistic take on what good quality care and support for autistic people right across the spectrum might look like. And one of the reasons that we wrote it was because up until the publication of the guide, all of the sort of models of care and support that were available had been created by professionals or professional-led groups rather than autistic people ourselves. And we wrote the guide for care providers, but also those who commission and pay for care and inspect care, and of course those who use care and support services to hold those services to account. And the guide is about care and support for autistic people of all ages across the spectrum. And we created it independently of those who provide care. It's currently available in both English and Portuguese. Hopefully it will soon also be available in French. So the guide sets out 10 key elements of quality of care, and it relates these to the care standards used by care inspectorates in all of the nations of the UK, and can be related to similar standards in other countries. And one of the reasons for doing it is to empower autistic people who are receiving care or support of various kinds to identify whether that care and support is actually of a good quality or not. And it also provides a means for care providers to really engage with autistic voice about what good quality care is, and to demonstrate, if they wish to do so, why their care is of good quality, and also for commissioners to hold care services to account in the same way. So a quick overview, the guide contains 10 core recommendations. First and foremost of which is the importance of respecting and promoting autonomy. Many care and support services say that they are person-centered, things of this nature. They give people choices, but rarely do they actually support autistic people, especially those with the most significant support needs, to genuinely increase our control over our own lives. So this is really talking about ensuring that those who need significant levels of care and support are treated as adults and have significant control of our own lives. Supporting autistic people right across the spectrum, including those with intellectual disabilities, to gain skills and experience in making decisions. We also highlight the importance of distinguishing between autonomy and independence. In recent years, with a lot of cuts to care and support, often there's a huge push for independence, but sometimes that can be actually in conflict with autonomy. Those with needs for care and support can need to be dependent on others in order to have effective control of our own lives. We also highlight the importance of reasonable adjustments, things like processing time, to actually empower autistic people to make our own decisions, and to recognise that as adults we have a right, particularly in line with the demands of the UNCRPD, to make decisions, even those that others may consider unwise, and also to be given full and honest information about our own lives. And we are encouraging care providers to review and question restrictions. Often care and support is excessively restrictive on the expectation of potential harm without always there being clear evidence of that actually being necessary. And it's also vital that where there are beautifully drawn up care plans that sound lovely, that they actually happen in practice. Our second recommendation is about supporting communication effectively throughout the lifespan, ensuring that care and support providers ensure their staff routinely are trained in and offer a range of forms of communication, that people with needs for care and support have good quality technology and internet access, and highlighting the importance of at least one of those providing support having the expertise to support individuals to develop functional communication. We highlight in the report a number of case studies which indicate the sort of thing that we would consider from our autistic perspectives as good practice, such as a project that took place in Surrey in the UK, which involved autistic people with moderate to severe learning difficulties, many of whom had been in hospital environments for a long time, and supporting them to have really good tailored communication support to find ways to assist them to communicate their needs. And over a number of years, this project has been extremely successful in supporting adults to use and embed individualized systems of communication, reducing frustration and enabling them to better communicate their needs. And these were a range of approaches used with people, but which genuinely empower the individual to communicate on their own behalf through a variety of methods so that they can express their wishes and preferences. We also recommend that care and support needs to be orientated to autistic norms and to prioritize the autonomy of the autistic person themselves and not what anyone else, whether that's family or care providers or those paying for the care, want for the person. Minimizing staff change is particularly important in a current climate in many parts of the world where care staff are chronically underpaid with very high turnover. And focusing very much on care which maximizes the individual's well-being and ability to function and reduces distress rather than focusing on normalizing or disguising distress. And routinely building into care and support autistic needs and norms, including respect for choices not to interact. We highlight the need to tackle environmental and other stresses, ensuring that sensory environments are tailored to autistic needs from autistic perspectives, ensuring that a range of sensory adaptations are routinely available and that staff behave in ways that prioritize autistic sensory needs. We also highlight that people need safe ways to meet their stimming needs, and that services should prioritize autistic norms like needing accurate, honest, specific information about what's going to happen, routine, structure, and predictability, and preparing people for changes. In the middle of our recommendations, we highlight the importance of care and support, focusing on barriers to access to wider society. Advocating effectively for autistic people, ensuring that we're fully involved in all forms of decision making, including voting and participating in wider society. Recognizing some of the health inequalities autistic people experience and challenging some of those, ensuring that people have reasonable adjustments made for them when accessing healthcare. Important that services supporting autistic people challenge rather than accept discriminatory treatment and facilitate people's access to their full rights of citizenship, ensuring that rather than merely being kept busy, autistic people of all kinds right across the spectrum are able to contribute to society, be seen as valuable individuals in their own right, and have the right to have meaningful lives in ways that are important to them. We build on that theme by talking about fighting stigma and discrimination more broadly in care services by focusing on rights primarily, supporting the rights of autistic people, and accepting as axiomatic that no autistic person requires long-term institutional care by reason of autism or indeed of learning disability. And the need for real, effective and measurable progress towards all autistic people living in the community. The long-standing problem of autistic people being detained in inappropriate institutions remains a very current one, with numerous abuse scandals taking place within those institutions and very little progress. And there is often too much risk aversion from those providing care and support, often based on erroneous beliefs that they have to keep everybody completely safe. And recognizing the need to have positive and accepting attitudes to autistic identity and to support individuals with high support needs to participate in and be connected to the wider autistic community. And that also involves discouraging people making fixed assumptions about the capabilities and incapacities of autistic people. Very importantly and relevantly, in the context of the discussion earlier about ABA, we recommend recognizing behavior as indicating distress, and essentially for a model which treats the use of any form of restraint as a failure and recommends that all services should seek to become zero restraint services. Challenging the propensity of talking about autistic people as if behaviors are an inevitable and inherent part of autism, instead of recognizing them as indicating distress. Similarly, we advocate for avoiding labels like complex and challenging because they have the effect of dehumanizing autistic people when what is needed is genuine empathy with autistic perspectives. We highlight the dangers of removing choice and control from autistic people and the importance of challenging any proposal that an autistic person needs specialist care, which removes them from their local community. And focusing primarily on the importance of modifying the environment to meet the person's needs rather than the person to suit the environment. We also highlight the importance of looking for underlying causes, avoiding a short-term oversimplification which focuses on triggers rather than looking at the cumulative stress autistic people experience. And we highlight the importance of working with rather than on autistic people who are experiencing distress, supporting them to feel safe and less distressed and to recover. We go on to highlight the need to focus on meeting needs rather than focusing on behavior itself, recognizing that not all behaviors are actually necessarily harmful and that things that are merely weird and don't infringe the rights of other people should be accepted and accommodated. And that autistic people should be supported to find ways to meet our needs in ways that don't infringe the rights of others. And also that sometimes, perhaps quite often in services, distress and challenging behavior are a result of a service or a situation being inappropriate for the individual in question. And often this is exacerbated by short-term decision-making based on funding issues. We highlight in there yet another case study, which I don't have time to go into in detail today, but this one of a special school which succeeded in a relatively short space of time to introduce and maintain a zero restraint policy. We also advocate for the need for better transitions, recognizing the difficulty of changes and transitions for autistic people and the importance of good advanced planning and being honest and open with autistic people about changes and transitions, recognizing that uncertainty and unpredictability are very stressful and often toxic for autistic people. We highlight the need for good, effective training of support staff and the need for it to be really practically focused, that merely sending people on awareness, e-learning and the like is really not adequate. That training for staff needs to be autistic-led and autistic designed whenever possible, and needs to ensure that staff are equipped with a really good understanding of human rights and the rights of adults to make their own decisions. And ensuring that the purpose of staff training is to promote empathy with autistic perspectives. Finally, we highlight the importance of positive autistic identity, supporting people towards diagnosis, avoiding the imposition of neurotypical ideas about what is normal, accepting choices to not interact, to maintain routines, and also facilitating access of all autistic people, including those with the highest support needs, to autistic controlled space and the wider autistic community. So I just want to finish up by telling you a little bit about where we are going with the NAT guide, because some of you may have heard a bit about the NAT guide before, but we are trying to build on this work. We have coming out quite soon a discussion paper based on recommendation 7, which has been funded by Skills for Care in the UK, which will try to set out an alternative approach to recognizing behavior as distress, and approaches which are not rooted in normalization ethos, but which work sympathetically with autistic perspectives, and highlighting a range of approaches that can actually be very helpful potentially for people who are quite distressed to experience less distress and to recover in an autistic friendly way without dehumanizing them. We're also hoping to take forward the recommendations, even though they are challenging. We are in the process of bidding on some research funding in the UK with the hope of running a large-scale research project with some care providers who are in the process of being recruited at the moment in the UK, to essentially put the principles of the NAT guide into practice in a range of care services and demonstrate the impact of this approach on measurable criteria, with the hope of essentially embedding this sort of autistic-led practice much more widely. What we recommend does involve some really significant shifts and some costs, but most of the challenges are cultural rather than financial. We're trying to develop an approach that involves staff having a genuine empathy with autistic perspectives and empowering autistic people who need care and support right across the spectrum to have a greater say and greater control of our own lives. And it's also an approach which is empowering for frontline staff, enabling them to develop their skills, because we are very clear that in order to provide good quality care and support, we need support staff who are sufficiently well paid to recruit the right people for the job with the right skills to support autistic people effectively and enable us to live the lives that we want. But there are advantages in here to services, and we do have quite enthusiastic interest from a number of care services in the UK who feel that the sort of model we are proposing may well be a way forward for them. And we're also trying to involve commissioners in essentially demonstrating that this kind of autistic-led approach to care and support for autistic people with the highest support needs can work, can be cost-effective, and can provide much better care which respects people's human rights. I think I will wrap up there. I know we have limits on time today. And I'll hand back to Heta for the management of questions.
Thank you. At this point, if there are one or two very quick questions to you, we could take them right now. And later on, we could take some more. Does anyone have a burning question on their mind? To move ahead, our next presenter is Professor Andrew McDonnell from Studio 3 on the low arousal approach. Andy, please.
Well, thank you first of all for allowing me to share some knowledge today. For those of you who've heard about sort of work my colleagues and I do, I apologise, I've tried to keep this short. I think it's really topical today to be talking about practices. It's just excellent, Fiona, to hear her presentation about ABA. I think there's always an issue for me about practitioners as opposed to labels of approaches, and that applies to all areas, something I'll come back to later on. And Yo standards of the National Taskforce. I will admit a confession that in the UK, I've been involved with an organisation called Lives with Friends, where we've been basically forcing commissioners on a case-by-case basis to get people out of hospital and institutional settings. The vast majority of those individuals happen to be autistic. And I think there's a growing understanding with the work of Yo and others that there really is a challenge for trying to provide so-called supports for people in institutional care. This week, for example, in the UK, there'll be yet another abuse investigation that's in court, and there'll be more in the future. And I think how we can raise standards in the future is going to be important. So really, very briefly, I myself, Andrew McDonnell, I'm the Director of Studio 3 Training Systems and Studio 3 Clinical Services. We work in several countries around the EU and actually in Canada as well, interestingly. The approach that I've been involved with, I originally described in the early 90s as the low arousal approach. At the time, I was looking particularly at how to manage crises, how to reduce restrictive practices. But I think actually the approach has evolved a little bit over the last 20 years. So I'm going to give people a little bit of a potted guide, a little bit about me. We want to eradicate all these kinds of practices. I've been involved in active research in this area where people debate which method is safer than another. They're all pretty much unsafe. Yeah, it's ridiculous that we can get into arguments about severity and degree. And I always use this image to remind myself that in my first job as a care worker, I was one of those people. I was one of those individuals who was told, we have to hold this person, we have to restrain them. Interestingly, my first job working in the NHS involved working with a number of individuals who were autistic, who were described as, to use Yo's words, challenging. So for me, my work started with how can we eradicate this area, restraint and restrictions, which then informed, when I became a clinical psychologist, my practice in general. You know, we can do better. In the UK at the moment, we have something called the Restraint Reduction Network. I'm very supportive of its standards. I don't like the name. If they talked about eradication and elimination, maybe it should evolve to something like that. How do you give up restraining people? Do you let go of one arm 1 week and one arm the other? We know how we do it. We create environments that are safe and supportive, that are empathic, trauma-informed often. It's the word that I would use, to avoid this model of madness that we have across the EU. And it's a model of madness. I work in Sweden, I work in other European countries where there are better resources quite often, but they still end up with places like this. Granted, as my Swedish colleagues would say, not in the same number and volume, but they are there because it's people who create these institutional practices, not just the money and the resources. So my approach, or the approach I use, I just put a label on it to managing crises, and it came from common sense about managing crises. If I'm not going to restrain someone, I must avoid very, very much increasing arousal in crisis situations. And we started using the term arousal in the 80s, and then it evolved. And again, it is really based on a logic. I was trained in behavioural psychology. I still am technically, but often we make people worse rather than better. About 2/3 of all challenging incidents, arguments, debates are triggered by ourselves. This ranges not just for the services for people who are autistic, it ranges across the board. But we don't get behaviour support plans. But the individuals that we focus on, we tend to overly focus and put them in analytical goldfish bowls, is what I like to describe it as. So for me, what evolved out about low arousal approach in crisis management was the idea of reflection. I'm not a paragon of virtue. I've made mistakes. I have escalated situations as well as de-escalated them. I've got to be careful what I say here. I was actually at a stag do with my sons this weekend. I actually managed to de-escalate a situation with some, shall we say, gentlemen, they're usually men, but not always, who were trying to throw us out of a bar because they thought my sons and our family were drunk. Wow, I managed to de-escalate it. How? By just talking to people in a very calm, regulated manner and saying, look, we're not drunk, but actually we'll go somewhere else. Yeah. Did it change me as a person? No. Did I feel like my alpha male or status has been challenged? Not much. The point about confrontation is it involves us and our behaviours and what we bring to a situation. So quite a lot of the approaches that my colleagues and I at Studio 3 involved with across the board, not just in training, but in our approach to, if you like, I hate the word clinical approaches, is actually to focus on stress reduction and stress elimination. So very simple definition. I've changed the definition about the low arousal approach many, many times, but I want to take an old definition here and I'd like to replace the word start with just behaviour. You don't need the word start. These are attempts to alter behaviour by avoiding confrontational situations and seeking the path of least resistance. This is us, not them, not you. Yeah. So it started with the idea of saying, actually, we're quite stressed as individuals. We like to impose control on people that frighten and scare us, but actually it starts with us. To use that phrase, to thine own self be true. Start to reflect on our own behaviour first before we start having the arrogance to focus on the behaviour of others. There's lots of really strong principles around the low arousal approach that have evolved. Yeah, some people have argued it's based in Buddhist and Quaker beliefs. I'm not a Buddhist, but I get where they come from with that. There are strong influences of things like mindfulness, but I would like to say not mindfulness to business. You might notice internationally that mindfulness seems to be the answer to everything, like CBT was years ago. It has a place as an approach, developing mindful practitioners. But I'm very, very wary of the fact that the philosophies that we owe really do owe to more than just one label or approach. My colleague, John McDermott at Studio 3 refers to the low arousal approach as being trans-diagnostic. You know, the kind of principles that we would talk about would equally apply to other vulnerable populations or crisis or confrontational situations. Central to all of it, though, is it's about our behaviour, us, not them. And that means that we have to be reflective in how we're supporting and working with individuals, and highly empathic too. Now, a phrase I've used quite a lot in my work is before you attempt to change or manage another person, you need to figure your own self out first and reflect on your own behaviour. I often ask to work, and my colleagues are, I'll be very frightened staff teams who are working around people that they can't emotionally connect with, and they're scared and they're frightened. And what happens when people are frightened and scared is they become more controlling. They don't back off, they don't take a few steps back, they actually impose more rules and regulations. It's why certain types of ABA approaches are so attractive to people, in terms of it gives them the idea that they can take control of situations. I'm not a fan. I've often seen those kind of practices, sanctions, consequences, actually make people's behaviour an awful lot worse. And the way to think about it is, it would make my behaviour a lot worse. It would make anyone's behaviour a lot worse if you impose control on an individual without their consent and without choice. I really want to draw on Fiona's presentation as well about consent being a big part of this, in terms of when she was looking at a survey. I would also argue that there is a huge issue around people working collaboratively with people, not just consent and getting permission. How much time do practitioners spend with individuals before they write plans about them? Even if they should write plans, it's arrogant to write a plan like we're behavioural doctors writing a prescription for someone. Here is your plan. This will now fix your behaviour. So what's evolved out of this, though, is that an understanding of stress, not just stressful environments, but people and stress, and how stress is transactional in nature, is critical to our approach. Good low arousal practices involve good stress management practices. And good stress management practices mean that we have to be regulated, not just the people we're supporting. I can't change someone's complex trauma overnight, but I can try and support them through their crises by regulating my own behaviour first. So understanding stress is key to all the approaches, be it in training or clinical, that my colleagues and I espouse. Recently we've been talking an awful lot more about trauma. Now I want to be very careful about this term because it's often loosely defined and overused. Somebody told me recently of an approach in the United States where they talk about trauma-informed restraint. What does that mean? What? I'm accepting your trauma while I hold you down? We've got to be very careful about pejorative words that are used, particularly trauma. Most of the people I work with are undoubtedly traumatized, either by the experiences of the world, by external traumas. And how would you work with people who are traumatized and stressed? You would not be demanding. You would not be confrontational. You would be accepting. You would try to be empathic and understanding. But actually, in our field and work, people find it really hard to do. They over-control individuals in these circumstances. Your comment about risk. We create clinical risk bureaucracies, usually with professional names attached to them. Somebody is too dangerous to go from a hospital community setting. I think a lot of my work and my colleagues' work is to smash through that bureaucracy at times. Yeah, there's no such thing as zero risk. But people also need to see that staying in hospital increases risk for people in institutions. The other issue for me is that when people are more stressed and traumatized, they become more hypervigilant. And if people are hypervigilant, they are very, very, very often wanting to escape from situations. They're uncomfortable. Their senses are going 2,000 miles an hour. So what we need to look at is that when we're looking at stress, stress is part and cornerstone of our approach. And particularly, control leads to over-control. I saw some of these, I think they called it a PBS plan recently that a parent asked me to look at. And it just read like a list of instructions for building an object. If that, do that. If this, do this. If that, do that. I looked at those number of statements and thought these are all demand-related statements. There are over 20 of them in this plan that have been written. And surprise, surprise, I've been asked to look at the plan because it didn't seem to be working. Because it's not about the plan, it's about the people. It's about the relationships that we have with people that make the difference. But over-controlling plans, over-controlling practices often occur when we are frightened or scared. One example of this is that perception of control is just as bad as actual control. I designed a questionnaire with a psychologist colleague of mine 10 years ago, actually called the Controllability Belief Scale. And this is a 15-item scale that asks people to think about a behaviour that challenges them. Bear with me, that was the logic at the time. actually fill out 15 simple attributional questions where you either attribute the behaviour to the person or to the situation. So some of the examples of some of the negative statements on a like up scale were things like, he or she is trying to wind me up when they do this. He or she is doing it deliberately. He or she knows what they're doing. I actually now use this scale differently in practice to get groups of people to think about when they're working with a behaviour that's actually frightening them or scaring them, are they starting to perceive that the person's got a plan and is doing things always in a willful manner? Because that's cornerstone again to our approach. About 80 to 90% of the people that I work with in their distressed situations or behaviours are not linked to some premeditated plan to hurt or harm anyone. You just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But if we perceive someone as doing things deliberately and on purpose, then actually we're going to perceive them as being more risky and dangerous. This questionnaire and others, all the stuff on this talk, you can always contact us at Studio 3. It's freely available and it's open source. And again, over-control also leads to rules and sanctions. As a young practitioner, when I first started working many years ago, eons ago in this field, I would write some of these plans that would have do's and don'ts. You know, I remember in my very early days as a clinical psychologist writing a plan that I would be totally ashamed of now, that talked about taking rewards and points away from someone who, if they misbehaved. Well, first of all, it didn't work. Secondly, I felt uncomfortable about writing it. And the more I thought about it, I didn't need to work in that way anymore. And I started to realise that the behavioural approaches that I'd been well trained in weren't enough. They didn't give me the full richness of understanding of the people that I was supporting. It was too much about A's, B's and C's and connections. And it saddens me to this day that if you think about the behaviour support community, I make a plea to people to not lump them all as one lump, ABA as a lump. The practitioners are as diverse as the neurodivergent community. What we need to do is split them apart in our campaigning, not join them all together. I have met practitioners with empathy who spend time with people and develop relationships, but I've equally met the analytical robots who believe that the solution to working with someone is to apply a study or an aversive approach that they've read about in some journal. You know, I think we're in a very, very difficult situation at the moment where ABA, or what generally is increasing in popularity, and actually treating them as one community is a mistake, in my opinion, especially if we want to campaign to stop the spreading of these approaches, which I would be on board with that. So, empathy and double empathy. I don't really have to say this to this audience here, to you guys, but you know, I love the concept of empathy and I love the concept of double empathy. I even said to Damien Milton recently, maybe triple empathy or quadruple empathy. Empathy for society, for people in general, not just for certain groups. But double empathy for me is a cornerstone of the low arousal approach. If I see that person as autistic, if I see that person as having sensory issues, if I see that person as being overwhelmed or confused, then I must respond in an empathic and sympathetic and compassionate manner, not with abusive use of rules, sanctions, restraints and controls. And I think that idea about empathy and double empathy, I've used an awful lot with some of the staff teams that I work with. You know, before we start talking about empathic issues, let's look at our own empathy for the people that we're supporting. Quite often in this day and age, we see individuals who are, yes, they are poorly paid. Yeah, they're not necessarily well trained, but they struggle to connect particularly with autistic people and other groups. We need to help people understand that mutually by getting people to walk a mile in someone's shoes to a degree, listening to the people that they support. And I mean listening, not just saying it as some pejorative word on a piece of paper. So for me, the idea of double empathy is critical. Yeah? Us, the so-called people practitioners who are sometimes supporting individuals to develop more empathy for individuals. Empathy leads to compassion, it leads to understanding. For me, it's the cornerstone of our approach. The other thing to understand is that it's not just fight and flight responses, but this kind of panic responses that we get around individuals. It's very hard to be in someone's presence and space who is very, very dysregulated, but it's not impossible. A lot of my work, again, goes back to the old adage, don't throw fuel on the fire. Try and be with someone. Try and be as non-threatening as possible. Try not to overly talk to people in those circumstances when they're stressed or distressed. Somebody asked me recently for a mantra about the low arousal approach, and I jokingly said, when in doubt, shut your mouth. If you're not sure, walk out the door and give the person space. It's actually an oversimplification, but you don't go far wrong when you're involved in that. And the third I would add is don't engage in an argument with someone. It's pointless at the end of it. To do our approaches, though, often requires courage to take a step back. This doesn't mean to say, as somebody on, I think it was LinkedIn the other day said, so in a low arousal approach, you would just watch someone self-injure. No, there are times where we have to keep people safe, but it's a narrow amount of times. I often find these individuals want to, they argue so much, to quote Shakespeare, they doth protest too much. They argue too much about low arousal means no arousal whatsoever. Not what we're saying. It means to reduce confrontation, we have to regulate ourselves. We have to minimize and eventually eradicate the use of things such as restraint from people's lives. And for some people, that's a journey. For others, it's not. It's as simple as taking those few steps back. But that requires people to be more courageous. Similarly, we don't talk about courage when we want to take people and take risks with individuals, the sort of thing that Yo was signposting again from the National Taskforce. We're trying to ask staff, supporters, families, parents to be a little bit more courageous at times. And that can be quite scary. Take that risk, take that person out in a controlled way. Recently, I was involved with a debate with someone who said that Studio 3 staff were cavalier with risks. No, not. But the fact that somebody wants to start an argument about it shows that we've actually connected in something in that person. Because it's to let go of control, to balance control a little bit more, so there's a balance between you and the person who's supporting, does require this one central word. A low arousal approach requires people to be more courageous, not less. Taking a step back from someone, clearing people out of the way as opposed to jumping on someone and restraining them. This is a mindset change and often a cultural change. It doesn't just occur on a training course. A key part for me of the whole approach is acceptance and, to a certain degree, understanding. I've learned so much over the years, often from the accounts of people who are autistic and often by engaging and working with individuals who are autistic, about the sheer trauma they experience sometimes in environments where they don't feel in control. This is true for all of us, but often particularly amplified for autistic people I work with. So sometimes we need to be looking more about developing not just knowledge about and understanding of autism, but understanding truly that that person sees the world sometimes differently from you or I. And we have to respect that difference. You all know that. Often people don't. Often what people are doing is trying to fix people and mold them into clones of what we want. Again, I was very interested in that survey where a comment of one of the participants was that, essentially that they weren't allowed to be autistic. They probably weren't allowed to sting. They probably weren't allowed to be themselves. One of the problems with individualised modules of care and support is a very, to use the UK phrase, it will translate to our European colleagues here, middle class. What I think is I value as a middle class person should be what everything our clients want. To give you an example, again, recently I worked with somebody and support somebody who really doesn't want to go outside their house too much. They find the world overpowering, but they exist more in the virtual world. Now I'm having to try and learn to enter that world with them. I am actually taking them out in the real world, but that's their experience. The goal is not to make that person more like me. It's to find that person's goal in life and help them find their way. And if that means, is it a problem that somebody spends 80% of their time in the virtual world? Well, it wouldn't be if you work for Microsoft or any of those other kind of areas. So sometimes I think there's an arrogance to the fact that often professionals particularly, and I still count myself as a clinical psychologist and I can't get away from that, sometimes don't develop enough understanding or acceptance of behaviours. We've also got to stop catastrophizing things all the time. I use the word aggression here deliberately. Some of the things that I get involved with, you'd think they were working with the son of Sam or a monster. What we've done is we've demonized people because when we're frightened and scared, we exaggerate. I use this particular clip quite a lot, because one of the first young men I ever worked with used to eat with a fork in an institution, and he just held with a blunt knife like this. And one day he punched a member of staff. That was written down as, he tried to stab me. We've got to stop catastrophizing incidents. We should figure out, how to manage and limit confrontation. But our minds tend to work overtime. If you look at the work of Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, who talks about our beliefs and biases, his amazing work that he really started a whole field of behavioural economics. He will tell you in his work and by the collective work, we are fraught with inherent biases, whether we're neurodiverse or not. And one of our biases is to catastrophize, is to magnify. Where with a lot of the people we support in situations, we're trying to minimise this, not ignore it, just minimise it. Avoiding catastrophization for me is key. Avoiding the verbal arguments, it's like a tug of war all the time. You see it day to day in my work, where sometimes taking a breath and taking a step back can be a very powerful way to avoid confrontation. I see it with the ABA debate. I try not to engage with it too much on Twitter and social media, because you have people just shouting at each other. And when you're shouting, you're not listening. But I do acknowledge why people are shouting. I think there's an awful lot of things that have been done in the name of behavioural psychology that people should be ashamed of collectively. There's also been some good, but mostly the sort of things that we would focus on, and rightly so, are things like the Judge Rotenberg Centre, where they use electric shock, and still do to a certain degree. What we need to do is take the extremism out of this kind of work, and that's going to take a collective view, and it also includes professionals listening to the neurodivergent community and actually listening about bad practice. I could see on Fiona's presentation about people wanting a position statement. I would go further, be very careful about just having a global position statement. Have position statements on restraint, elimination, position statements on reducing seclusion. Be very specific about these things. They're not using punitive sanctions. Never writing a plan for someone without some kind of informed consent is sought from the person or their supporters. The more that we actually nail this down, the more we can keep the behaviour support community honest. I know from looking at the presentation, a lot of people just like to see ABA banned. I don't think it's going to happen. But what we can do is minimise the effect of it, reduce its popularity, and actually contain it with rules that are actually sensible. Because at the moment, it's an unregulated industry. But avoiding verbal arguments for me is a cornerstone of the arousal approach. But it's quite hard to do in practice when you feel threatened. Non-verbal communication is really powerful. How you sit, how you stand. I can't stress how much that when I'm supporting people who are supposedly non-verbal, which we know is a bit of a misnomer, it's about how we are presenting ourselves in a non-threatening way. Where I'm talking to you today is one of our offices. It's got 3 sofas in it. I was talking to a young man the other week who came in, we had the lights on, a little bit of music, and he said, "Oh, this is not what I was expecting." And I said, "Is that good or bad?" He went, "Good. I thought I was coming to a clinic to see you." So understanding these non-verbal cues of sound, this is a little bit of a joke, but take a look at this image and stare at those eyes of this person here. Most people report that direct eye contact is arousing, but it's also quite scary. Now look at the same person's image who's just changed their gaze. Often people for this image say that person looks sad. Actually, this person is me. I put it in my original book, The Reflected Journey. I was in a grumpy mood one day. I was looking at the pictures that had been produced for it, and actually by actors, and I didn't think this picture looked particularly emotive enough. So, for us, the key to our approaches is co-regulation. We've got to start talking just about environments, but it's the people within environments that make the difference. Often when people say it's all about the environment, they start talking about changing the lighting in a room. These are important, but it's about co-regulation. Better trained staff who get to know an individual, who are highly reflective, adopt a low arousal approach, often in my experience don't need a lot of this other stuff. This mumbo jumbo and this pseudo-science that we've emerged in this area. And for me, it's about co-regulation. We start with regulating ourselves when someone's distressed, not them. Focusing less on the behaviour and more about your own regulation. increasingly my work, I've been using a lot about zones of regulation, you know, blue zones, red zones, actually to get away from the word behaviour with staff. How much time of the day have you been in your green zone? What about the individual? How much time of the day have they been in their green zone? It just gets rid of that word behaviour. Yeah. So I tried to give you a potted guide to what we're about, but I think in terms of the debate today, the low arousal approach for me is something that it's a humanistic approach, but it's actually not easy to do. I'm going to plug a couple of my books. I'm also going to plug the slow arousal training online. I suppose what people need to understand, it takes place every Friday. It's an introductory webinars, and actually for people with lived experience, certainly for any individuals in your communities here, it's free. So if you contact our office and say, I'd like to claim this a free places, we will do it. In fact, over the next few months, we're going to make it entirely free, this introductory program, because we've had a lot of uptake of people since lockdown joining it online. I'll stop there. I'll stop my screen sharing. Sorry for murdering the approach and rushing through it too much.
And now I would like to ask everyone if you have any questions for Fiona, Yo, or Andy. Fiona, first, I get the feeling that whatever differences we saw between countries are not meaningful, as you know, finding people in this way is too biased and the numbers were much too small. So did you get that impression also that the differences between countries might have been just random?
Yeah, I don't think there are, as you say, significant differences between countries. I think some countries may be further in their journey with having explored the whole topic and looked into it, and therefore that would have maybe influenced maybe the extent to which there is the extent to which they had concerns, and may have influenced the extent to which they were aware of the situation in their country. But the overall pattern was the same. In terms of sample sizes being too small and things, I think what is striking is, yes, some responses from countries, it was very few, and they would have been not capturing probably the spread across everything by any means. But I think what it did, because of the consistency in some of the themes across the countries, that, yeah, so whilst individually they're not huge, what we're seeing across the landscape was consistent in terms of themes. And I think that can let us know maybe about then what next steps are. And Andy mentioned about, is it about banning ABA? Well, we know what is ABA, and in fact that was some of the themes that came out too. What are we, what are people commenting on? But that's where people are at. And I think Andy makes a comment that it's effectively unregulated. That's interesting because apparently in the UK it is now regulated. That's how it's positioned. and I
know that's how they like to position it. It's not, so I think deregulated industry.
Yeah, I mean, I get it is effectively totally unregulated, although the way it's positioned and structured and one way it grows and gets authenticity, I suppose. So what do? Do we so it's very interesting about effective ways forward, which is the issue. And I think each country is going to be different in where they are, and therefore maybe what makes sense for them to do. Because many countries, I don't believe these methods are necessarily implicit and embedded throughout in the same way as others. So there may be slightly different tactics to be taken in that sense.
But thank you first to all the presentation. They were very interesting. And Fiona, I saw that there were ABA people receiving ABA in Belgium, which is something I was not aware of. And so I think other people are not very much aware of that. And I was wondering, so if you have data for how much people were receiving it, or if I feel it would be very interesting to have the information of how much it exists now in the various European countries, and how much it is growing, because it would also help us to make people aware of that, because we are not really aware of that.
I think that's one, thank you for those comments. I think one thing that did come out, some of the pie charts I showed, which said, you know, to what extent is ABA in your country and to what extent is ABA growing in your country, there were quite large or grey coloured bits, which are people who didn't know. So as part of really what this is all about, and this is, I think this is part of a broader effort, isn't it? It's about understanding what are helpful, what can be harmful approaches for autistic people, and ensuring that people are educated to understand that and more informed, you know, whether they're a parent or a practitioner or an advocate, when they're involved in decisions about whether it's an individual themselves or influencing policy. It's about knowing, being informed in that sense. And, you know, my experience, I mean, I'm in Scotland and we're a bit different in Scotland. We're having similar issues, but at a different stage maybe to what's happening in England. You know, and I see a key way that, you know, harmful practice is growing, practice that doesn't consider it needs to understand or be co-produced with autistic people or empathize with autistic neurology and respect autistic neurology. So harmful practice is growing based on people not understanding that it's harmful or hearing only certain practitioners talk about their ways and using various rhetoric to grow. So there's a few bits, and I think the report we'll be looking at putting recommendations in the report, some thoughts reflecting on the output, but also reflecting on experiences and to go from there. But yes, it's difficult to know the extent to which it is being used. Often these methods aren't necessarily even called that. As Andy said, it can be a question of labels. So therefore it is important to understand what makes something harmful or helpful. And you know, at the moment, and the survey, whilst it used a bland label, it was important because it got a lot of the themes out about what can make an approach harmful, or without maybe not bedding it down that specifically, but be talking about, well, certain approaches under this umbrella are causing harm. This needs to be looked at a bit more so we can bed that down about what could cause, you know, what is helpful and what isn't.
We have a comment in the text channel. Anka says, in general, you can follow the growth of ABA via find certificate on the BACB website and the country you're interested in. So you have starting points. Yeah, go ahead. There's also a report that came out, someone shared to me just the other day, around November, which is from the European ABA folk, looking at snapshot state of play in all the countries too. Let me try and share that in the chat now, actually, if I can find it. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to lay my hands on it very easily. Sorry. Okay, but thank you for letting us know. And I would say those grey sections in the responses, I think it's a very genuine lack of knowledge. And because in Finland, the discussion on this theme became very active very recently. And it is clear that no one knows. The autism organizations certainly do not know how much this method is being used, or these various methods.
Could I make a comment about that, Hector? Because I work across Europe a lot, and there's a lot of politicization of this. Actually, some of these programs are very small. I think Isabel's from Belgium. There was a bit of I refer to them as outbreaks. Countries have focuses on reducing some these approaches, and then they pop up again somewhere else. Yeah, Ireland years ago, there was a period about 20 years ago where the Department of Education, the government were being influenced, and it looked like everyone was getting what you might call classroom-based ABA training. Then it died out, and then it came back. And I think one of the issues is that we're dealing against an industry here. It's an industry driven by profit, and any industries that are driven by profit will try and sell you their stuff. I think one of the issues that you guys can do that's really powerful is actually these advisory documents that you could produce from the community is to influence politicians and others. Yeah, these people aren't going to go away. I'd love a world where we just evolve to simpler, stress-free, low arousal approaches. And we are winning, is what I would say over time. Over the last 30 years, we're winning, but it's still going to be slow. But what happens is they arrive in the country and you get this almost marketing experience on TV and on the radios, and it's ABA is the only way. I posted something recently on Twitter because I occasionally like to taunt the community with what's the difference between ABA and ABBA. Well, one of them is the pop group ABBA, and actually I'll still be listening to ABBA songs in 50 years' time. I won't be reading B.F. Skinner, but I did when I was a youngster. And I think what we're getting here is an industry. Masters programs are abounding in countries, which then fuels this system, but it is an unregulated industry. I gave a talk last year for the British Institute of Learning Disabilities, and somebody said I was a PBS practitioner. All I said was, I don't think I am, but if I was, I'm clinging on by my fingernails because I don't like the industry and I don't like how people are using this. So to me, there are pockets in different places. There are areas. If you want a country, I don't want to get into trouble here, Norway. Ivor Lovas, Professor Lovas, was Norwegian. Where do you think he went most summers? He went back to the old country. As a country in European circles, I'm not damning the whole country, you'll find more Lovas style approaches in Norway than any other country in Europe. There, I've said it. I'll probably get sued for that as well, but there you go.
Mm-hmm. I understand as the BACB certification based in the US is going to be stopping to other parts of the world. And there is some planning going ahead to create a similar European system. Does anyone have knowledge or comments on that one?
But they will do it. BCBAs, board certified behaviour analysts. To me, and I will say it publicly, it's not a profession. It's something made up by some radicals. In the UK, there's a BC, they have these organisations. I think the key thing is, I actually think they should have standards. If we can't get rid of them, we've got to hold their feet over the fire. You know, what is, you know, and I think that's where we're moving towards. But, you know, I trained as a psychologist. I spoke to a psychologist who is also a BCBA. I won't say who he is because he's quite well known in the UK, and said, why did you need that other qualification? We had quite a row over it at the time. I think Fiona might have got to be careful, you might guess who it was, but that's the point about it. They're creating a profession around behaviour. What's your job? I fix cars. What's your job? I do behaviour.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of comment on what Andy said about the benefits and the importance of influencing those who have influence, because certainly in my experience in England, there is a really serious information gap in that PBS, which is based on ABA, is taken by most practitioners because it's taken by politicians as the norm, the gold standard. There is no other way. And the vast majority of well-meaning practitioners simply do not know that there is any other way. So one of the things that hopefully we're going to achieve in the very near future is we've been in discussions for quite a long time with Skills for Care, which is a Quango in the UK, who are very influential in the social care field. And on their website, when you search on their website for challenging behaviour, you get a page all about PBS. And we have a meeting with them that does coming up next week about us rewriting that page to, yes, it will still mention PBS. However, it will also mention other things and that there are other ways. And hopefully we'll link to our forthcoming discussion paper, which highlights as many other ways as we can find, including the low arousal approach.
Another thing, Fiona, you said, I think that there were 73 or 76 responses from people who said they had been through ABA themselves.
Yeah, so there were 159 had received ABA. A chunk of those also had family members who had ABA as well, so it wasn't just their own experience.
Yeah. In those with first-hand experience, how many of them described their experience?
Yeah, there were 73. Well, the way that what we need to do is we need to do this analysis, because the way the survey was, it said, what is your experience? Would you like to talk about your experience? So in that box, some people did say I was in ABA from 3 to age 6. Then I did some social skills training for the next 4 years. Then in the concerns and other comments boxes where they elaborated more about how it made them feel and their personal views, etc. Of all the comments, including some that talked about their experience and others that just stated the type, and there were 73, of which 73 altogether comments in there. But a lot of the comments are coming out in the, please tell us about the general nature of your concerns about ABA in your country. And then what we were seeing, they there would be saying, well, I'm concerned about this being my country and growing, so I don't want other people to have what I went through, or they spoke about their experience more in those boxes. So that's where it'd be useful for us to do further analysis across the open-ended questions.
We had 10 people out of 73 saying they had a positive experience of ABA. It's something where we will need to look into it, like what kind of research in the future is necessary. And I know that the overall sentiment is very strictly against ABA, but I do think we need to be cautious here to not create an atmosphere where people are afraid to talk about their genuine experience. If something in ABA or something called ABA, while not actually the thing itself, has actually benefited them, people should be allowed to express any kind of experience. Otherwise, we will seriously skew our results and our advocacy.
Yeah, so it's really important to see what people said, and and as I mentioned at the beginning, that we are not validating comments, not validating people's experience. I'm sure some of the responses didn't quite tie into other bits that they said, so you're just wondering about people trying to get a view in there somehow. But it's important, that there will be people who have had positive experiences. Of the 10 in the comments, they weren't all necessarily commenting about their experience. It might have been in terms of a positive stance, but just stating what it was. So we'll get more into that analysis. And as you say, we need to keep an open dialogue, not shut it. So we need to hear all people's views and understand. Interestingly enough, for those that gave positive experience, very few actually gave any details to contact for further information. So it's not like we can go beyond what was reported to us in that survey.
No, and I believe the resources and the overall approach in this survey don't really allow that, but it does give, I think, some hints at what directions people could go next. And I would like to ask also Andy and Yo, what kind of research do you think would help at this point if we try to influence the directions of research and funding in the future?
I'm a convert over the last 20 years to qualitative research. I think quantitative research in this field is a nonsense. We're not doing randomized control trials. What we're trying to do is get people's experiences. And I think we can do an awful lot of taking some of these accounts of people's, deconstructing it, drawing out the themes. So for example, for me, deconstructing what people find useful or not helpful around these things involves just asking people. It's the challenge for us is that often a lot of even the better journals don't take qualitative research. They claim they do. It's getting better, but it's very slow. What they want is just quantitative work. Just to give an example from actually work quite a few years ago, that something like 90% of research monies in the West in autism was spent on genetics and genetic studies and genetic research and genomes. Very little was spent on how to help people or how to develop stress management or coping skills for people. Anything like that was a tiny proportion. And I think things like the Participative Autism Research Group and others, I think what we need to do is to hear the voice of the community an awful lot more, to say, what is it you actually need? Not what the researchers want to study. I live in fear that we could have another big PBS study. Are you aware that there was a PBS study done in the UK a few years ago? that was published that showed negligible results by the great and the good. It's hardly even reported in the literature. You can look up the work of Angela Hassiotis and her team at King's College London. It barely even moved the needle, and when it did, it was torn apart by PBS and ABA researchers. It's a good study. So I don't think that changes minds, but I think what does change minds is people's experiences. So my bias is more qualitative participatory research, more research has collaborations between people who are neurodivergent, autistic researchers and non-autistic researchers. We've got to build collaboration in here if we want to get that narrative moving forward. That's my own biases, that's all. Sorry, I mean, what would you add to that? I mean, probably loads. But...
Yeah, I think two key points that I'd like to make. One is that we need to be very, very careful when research in this area is seeking to hear the voice of neurodivergent people, that is not solely the voice of speaking neurodivergent people.
Yes.
And not also authentically including the perspectives of autistic people right across the spectrum, including those who have the least say in their care and support. And I think that there is an argument, and indeed the study I was talking about that Nat is working towards in collaboration with a number of researchers, will involve some ethnographic methods involving autistic researchers spending time in services with other autistic people, seeking to take quite novel approaches to actually representing the full range of perspectives. So I think that's very important. But the other thing is, I mean, whilst research is important, in all honesty, in my experience, it has limited impact on policy. And to be honest, in the real world, what drives policy on the whole are soundbite stories, what you can get in the media, and also, you know, lobbying, essentially. And that, yeah, frustrating as it is, often really counterintuitively from an autistic logical perspective, no matter how much you prove stuff, it doesn't actually make any difference whatsoever to what people do. And so in my experience in social care, and something that I think we're trying to work towards in NAT, and in fact the original idea behind the NAT guide was when I said slightly tongue-in-cheek, well, if we want to rival PBS in the UK, well, we need to invent something with a snappy acronym and sell it.
Yeah, I agree. And my view is also that a lot of research ends up just gathering dust. But I would say that in EUCAP, we are trying at least to find out enough about our members' views to try to represent them accurately. Concern has been from comments that I get from some countries, people saying it's just not common here. It is a non-issue in this country because no one can afford it or something along similar lines. So we show the variety of views, and especially how high up people put it on their list of concerns.
And that's good, because I would echo some of what Andy said about, you know, some of the big issues being restraint, seclusion, inappropriate institutions, and dehumanizing approaches, whatever you call them.
I mean, I mentioned about the project I'm involved in, and we're not broadcasting it about getting people out of hospital in the UK. One thing that's really important is that when I do presentations with my colleagues at School Lives Through Friends, there are other organisations when we do it, what we're telling people is, and by the way, actually individualisation the way we do it is cheaper in the long run. And nearly every politician will say the same thing. We're not interested in money. They are. By definition, they're always interested in money. And actually getting this message over that being person-centred, being respectful, individualised, actually can be a lot, not huge cheaper, but cheaper than locking people up in very expensive institutions. And I think it's that idea about what's cost effective, which politicians don't mention, is part of it. There was an ABA study done in Denmark 16 years ago by a researcher called Kjell Hirdsbro. And what he demonstrated was, he's a sociologist by background, was that the ABA programs he looked at was more expensive. He couldn't find much outcomes in terms of his other part of the study, but he said it cost twice as much as standard engagement in the Danish system. And he couldn't get his study, I can tell you factually, he couldn't get his study published in some of the larger peer-reviewed journals, because at the time, nobody wanted to know. I was over in Denmark last year and nobody's heard of his study. It's disappeared. I've got it. It's a very good study to say, look, you've got to look at costs if you're going to look at programs, not just financial costs, emotional costs, social costs. I think there's a lot of clever stuff we could do if we campaign. That's it. Count me in, Yo. And if you want any help in any other way, or Fiona, count me in. Yeah, honestly.
Yeah.
I want to cause more trouble over the next few years. That's my new goal.
Yeah.
I want to cause more trouble.
Surprised me recently is that there's a newly started project in Finland where a university hospital and an ABA providing company are starting a study on the effectiveness of early intensive behavioral intervention. And it just occurs to me that there's so much of this kind of research and so much criticism aimed at it. Is what can we possibly add to that body of literature? So we will just be watching with great interest, seeing where that's going to go. And now we're nearly running out of time, but I would like to point out on a text channel, there's a comment on that there's been some success in raising these issues with the government committee examining Ireland's upholding of the UNCRPD. And the committee has said that ABA PBS are not consistent with human rights obligations under the UNCRPD. And there's a link, so anyone who wants to delve into the details and the wordings of that can pursue that. And comment from Korea, I believe, pointing out that there's a similar references in the dialogue between France and the UNCRPD. I would like to thank you, everybody, for the interesting presentations and the active discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. No, it's a bank holiday weekend as well, so in the UK anyway, so great.